History often moves with a strange kind of efficiency. It does not linger. It does not hesitate. It arranges events into neat paragraphs and tidy conclusions, smoothing jagged edges into sentences that feel almost weightless. Somewhere in a textbook, a single line might read, "An unsuccessful night maneuver resulted in heavy casualties." The words sit calmly on the page. Unsuccessful maneuver. Heavy. Casualties. Clean. Controlled language. But what does heavy mean when counted in human breath? What does unsuccessful feel like when you are standing in the dark, listening to your own heartbeat echo inside your helmet? The night itself did not feel efficient. It unfolded slowly, as nights do, pulling a curtain of darkness across the land. Without urgency, the sky lowered into shadow. The wind moved through torn fabric and half-buried wire. Boots shifted against damp soil. Metal touched metal somewhere in the distance, a quiet clink, quickly swallowed by the open air. Men stood in formation, though formation suggests a confidence that did not truly exist. Some whispered reassurances. Some checked equipment again and again, not because it needed checking, but because stillness felt worse. On paper, it would later become an operation, a maneuver, something deliberate and contained. But in that moment, it felt like waiting on the edge of something undefined. No grand speech split the silence. No dramatic charge began the night. There was only anticipation stretching thin across exhausted nerves. A few soldiers pretended calm, adjusting straps with steady hands. Others stared forward without speaking, sensing, in a way they could not quite explain, that something about this plan did not settle correctly in the mind. This was not the decisive battle of the war, not the turning point. Historians circle in bold ink. No empire would rise or fall because of these few hours. Maps would remain mostly unchanged. That is what makes the silence heavier. If it was not pivotal, not essential, not the hinge upon which history swung, why did so many lives hang in balance beneath that moonless sky? The answer does not begin with destiny. It begins with decision. Textbooks rarely pause long enough to show how ordinary the beginning felt. Darkness settled the same way it had every night before. The ground remained indifferent. The wind did not whisper warnings. Nothing in the landscape announced catastrophe. And yet, within that stillness, an irreversible movement had already begun, not of troops, but of thought. Orders had been written. Timetables adjusted. Confidence declared where doubt might have been wiser. It is easy, years later, to imagine inevitability. To believe that tragedy carries a certain theatrical weight, as though the world must tremble before it occurs. But most disasters arrive quietly. They begin with clipped conversations and signatures on paper. They begin when someone chooses momentum over patience, when appearing decisive feels more urgent than being correct. Somewhere, far from that field, the coming hours would eventually shrink into a brief summary. The night would be pressed flat, between larger campaigns and more triumphant victories. Thousands of footsteps would dissolve into one phrase: heavy casualties. No mention of the way the air felt colder than expected. No record of how uncertainty moved through the ranks faster than orders. If thousands of deaths can be compressed into one sentence, perhaps it is because unfolding them fully would require more than a page. It would demand sitting inside the darkness long enough to feel its texture. And that is something history, in its haste, rarely allows. To understand how that still, unremarkable night became lethal, we must step backward, away from the field, and into the rising pressure that gathered long before the first boot touched the darkened ground. Long before boots pressed into wet soil, pressure had already begun to gather in quieter rooms. The war, once fueled by momentum and certainty, had slowed into something stubborn and uncertain. Front lines moved inches instead of miles. Reports spoke less of victory and more of endurance. In distant offices, political leaders studied maps marked with stubborn stalemates, their fingers tracing lines that refused to shift. Progress was demanded not because the ground allowed it, but because morale required it. On the battlefield, soldiers felt a different kind of strain. Supplies no longer arrived with reassuring regularity. Ammunition was counted carefully. Rations were thinner than before. Letters from home carried questions that were difficult to answer. How much longer are you advancing? There was a quiet understanding among the ranks that waiting had begun to feel heavier than fighting. Inside headquarters, The tone was sharper. Meetings stretched late into the evening. Voices remained measured, but urgency clung to each discussion. Intelligence reports arrived in uneven waves. One dispatch suggested the enemy line had weakened. Their forces stretched thin. Another warned of reinforcements gathering beyond view. No report offered certainty. Each one left room for interpretation. Interpretation in times like these can be dangerous. Commanders were not reckless men. They understood risk. They understood terrain. What they also understood was the pressure of appearing stalled. A paused army can look defeated, even when it is merely cautious. Every day without visible movement fed speculation back home. Newspapers grew impatient. Questions multiplied in government halls. The planned maneuver had originally been scheduled for dawn. It made sense. Light reveals terrain. Signals travel more clearly when shadows do not distort them. Units move in coordination when they can see the outline of each other's advance. It was, by most accounts, the reasonable choice. But reason exists beside perception, and perception often carries more immediate weight. Hours before execution, as reports continued to contradict each other, a subtle shift occurred. Waiting until sunrise began to feel like hesitation. What if the enemy strengthened overnight? What if the delay signaled uncertainty? What if caution was mistaken for weakness? These questions did not shout. They lingered. A revised order was drafted. The attack would move forward. Under cover of darkness, the justification sounded practical surprise. Momentum. Initiative. Yet beneath those words was something less strategic and more human. A refusal to appear still. Momentum had become currency. To pause was to risk confidence. No dramatic announcement marked the change. No red flag signaled catastrophe. It felt, in the moment, like adaptation, a calculated decision based on incomplete information. The kind leaders make in war every day. But decisions made in uncertainty often reveal more about psychology than strategy. In headquarters, maps remained steady under lamplight. Timetables were adjusted. Messages relayed. The air inside those rooms carried tension, but also resolve. Outside, the soldiers preparing for a dawn maneuver began to receive new instructions. Darkness would conceal them. Darkness would protect them. It is striking how easily a timeline can shift. Sunrise replaced by midnight. Visibility exchanged for shadow. The terrain unchanged, yet suddenly transformed by the absence of light. The tragedy forming here was not born of cruelty or ambition. It grew from impatience wrapped in logic. Leaders acted not because they were certain, but because uncertainty felt intolerable. Hesitation can appear dangerous in war. It can feel like surrender before the battle begins. So the plan, once meant for sunrise, moved quietly into the night. And now that the decision had stepped into darkness, the narrative must follow it downward. Back to the ground, where shapes blur, signals falter, and certainty dissolves as soon as the light disappears. When the order finally moved through the lines, it did not arrive with drama. It passed from mouth to ear, from shadow to shadow, quiet and controlled. Units stepped forward almost gently, as if the ground itself might object to sudden movement. Lanterns were shielded beneath coats to keep their glow from drifting too far. The terrain, uneven and unfamiliar, offered no clear path. Men advanced by memory and outline, trusting faint shapes more than sight. For a few minutes it seemed to work. Boots pressed carefully against damp earth. Metal rested silent against fabric. Breathing remained measured. Coordination depended on timing more than vision. Each group counted under their breath, trying to maintain distance from the unit ahead. But darkness does not respect precision for long. A signal was meant to travel along the left flank first, a subtle flare designed to mark position rather than command action. It rose into the air earlier than expected, its arc misjudged by a nervous hand. In that instant, the flare looked less like a marker and more like an incoming shell. Those who saw it from the corner of their vision did not pause to interpret. They reacted. Gunfire answered light. Shots cracked through the night, sudden and sharp, breaking the fragile rhythm that had barely held formation together. Some soldiers dropped instinctively. Others returned fire toward the direction from which they believed danger had come. Shadows moved quickly, but in darkness every movement resembles threat. What was meant to be a coordinated advance fractured into isolated reactions. Commands were shouted, but direction dissolved as sound ricocheted across uneven ground. Units that were supposed to move parallel drifted inward, converging without realizing it. The line blurred. Formation bent until it no longer resembled a line at all. Then came the first cries. They were not shouts of charge or battle. They were startled, confused, human. A name called out. A voice asking for light. Another insisting to cease fire, unheard beneath the crack and echo of rifles. In the dark, silhouettes overlap. The shape of a helmet becomes the outline of an enemy. A crouched figure, preparing to reposition, appears like someone taking aim. Decisions are made in fractions of a second. In that hour, fractions multiplied. The first major casualties did not fall under an enemy barrage. They fell under friendly fire. Somewhere along the right flank, a cluster of soldiers fired into a group advancing on what they believed was the opposing line. The figures dropped. Only after moving closer did they recognize familiar uniforms against the soil. Recognition traveled slower than bullets. By the time it settled in, panic had already taken hold. Commanders attempted to regain control. Whistles pierced the air. Orders were shouted to hold position, to identify targets, to cease unnecessary fire. But unnecessary had already become indistinguishable from necessary. Men who believed they were under attack did not wait for clarity. The unbearable detail is this: the enemy had not yet engaged. Across the field, startled by the sudden eruption of noise, opposing forces initially assumed a misfire or probing action. They hesitated, listening to the chaos unfold. The gunfire that woke them was not directed at their line. It was self-inflicted. That realization never reached those struggling to regain order. In darkness, perception outran truth. Within that first hour, timing collapsed completely. Units lost track of their positions. Some advanced too far, others fell back without instruction. Signals meant to correct direction were mistaken for commands to intensify. Fear moved faster than coordination ever had. The ground, moments ago only damp and uneven, now felt treacherous. Every shadow threatened. Every sudden movement demanded response. What began as a planned maneuver dissolved into fragmented survival. And above it all, in tents lit by controlled lamplight, fragmented reports started to travel upward. Gunfire movement. Resistance. The words carried no indication that the first enemy encountered had been mistaken identity. Down below, the hour that broke formation was still unfolding. Up above, it was being misunderstood. Inside the command tent, the night felt different. The wind still brushed against canvas walls, but it sounded softer here, muted by distance and lamplight. Maps lay pinned across folding tables, their lines clear and composed. Positions were marked with careful precision. Arrows indicated movement. Timetables rested beside them, written in steady ink. The world on those maps appeared orderly, almost obedient. Then the first reports began to arrive. A runner entered, breath tight but disciplined. Gunfire along the left flank, movement progressing. No confirmation of resistance. The commanding officer listened without alarm. Night operations often sound louder than they are. Echo that it carries unpredictably across open terrain. He nodded once, absorbing the information like a man watching a machine operate as expected. More fragments followed. A signal light observed. Engagement underway. No retreat indicated. No retreat indicated. Those words carried weight. In war, a retreat travels quickly. It bursts through communication lines with urgency. Silence, by contrast, feels stable. If no unit reports falling back, then surely they are holding position. If they are holding position, perhaps they are advancing. Outside, shots cracked irregularly across the field. Inside, the noise reached them softened and distant, like weather rolling over hills. The officer leaned closer to the map, tracing the planned progression. With one finger, the timing matched. The engagement appeared to be unfolding within expected margins. Incomplete information has a peculiar effect on the mind. It invites assumption. Human thought prefers continuity over doubt. If the plan was sound and no evidence of failure has arrived, then it must be working. Another messenger arrived, though his wording carried faint hesitation. Confusion near center positions. Visibility limited. Requests clarification of signal timing. The commanding officer interpreted this as typical friction. Night maneuvers are rarely smooth. Hesitation often signals adjustment, not collapse. He issued a steady reply. Maintain course. Advance as instructed. Hold formation. Some messages never reached him at all. Lines faltered in the dark. Signals lost direction. A junior officer several ranks below drafted a cautious note, suggesting a pause to reassess. Reports of crossfire. Unclear target acquisition. That message, carried by a messenger diverted by shifting terrain. By the time it arrived at an intermediary station, it was folded beneath newer updates and never rose to the top of priority. Confidence, meanwhile, began to harden. Scattered gunfire suggested contact. Contact implied movement forward. Movement forward meant initiative. The officer's mind assembled these pieces into coherence. No reports of catastrophic loss had surfaced. No command for emergency withdrawal echoed through the canvas. Silence, though fractured by sound, felt intact. He stood upright, hands clasped behind his back, listening carefully. The rhythm of shots rose and fell, irregular but persistent. To him, it sounded like pressure applied to a resisting line. He imagined his units pushing steadily through darkness, pressing advantage under cover of night. They believed the battle was unfolding exactly as planned. That belief did not come from arrogance. It came from pattern recognition, from past experience, from trust in preparation. Plans rarely survive intact in war, but neither do they usually collapse within the first hour without clear indication. The tragedy of this moment lies not in cruelty or ambition, but in interpretation. Reports trickled in thin streams, leaving space between them wide enough for imagination to bridge. In that space, optimism filled gaps where caution might have entered. Beyond the tent walls, confusion multiplied. Units mistook shadows for threat. Orders collided. Gunfire answered uncertainty. But here, under steady lamplight, the map still looked orderly. If command misread silence as success, then what truth lay hidden beneath the distant crack of rifles, spreading unseen across the field below? Across the field, beyond the drifting smoke and fractured lines, the opposing force waited beneath its own stretch of darkness. Their expectations had been shaped by routine. If an assault came, it would likely arrive at dawn, when visibility favored coordination and timing could be judged by light. Night, in their calculation, was a space for tension, not full engagement. So when the first shots cracked through the air hours before sunrise, confusion settled over their ranks as well. Officers leaned out from behind low barriers, listening carefully. The pattern of gunfire sounded irregular, uneven. It did not carry the rhythm of a disciplined advance. Instead of a steady progression across the front, there were bursts, scattered in odd directions. Some units prepared to reposition defensively, anticipating a minor probing maneuver designed to test their response. Others remained still, waiting for confirmation. At first, the assumption was simple. The attacking side had chosen surprise. Perhaps a limited incursion under cover of darkness. Perhaps an attempt to weaken the line before morning. There was no immediate urgency to counter. Night can distort sound. It can exaggerate threat. Better to conserve strength until daylight clarified intent. But, as minutes passed, something about the noise shifted. Shots erupted, not in a clean forward arc, but in intersecting clusters. The spacing did not suggest an advancing line pressing outward. It suggested units firing across overlapping angles. Enemy observers exchanged uncertain glances, a deceptive strategy designed to create the illusion of disorder. Or was the disorder genuine? Then came confirmation, subtle and unsettling. Intercepted fragments of communication, picked up faintly between exchanges of static, hinted at crossfire within the attacking force. Urgent calls referencing friendly positions. Requests to identify targets. A pause demanded amid escalating gunfire. It became clear that the attackers were striking their own formations. The hesitation that had held the opposing side in watchful restraint dissolved almost instantly. Commanders recalculated with sharpened focus. What had sounded like initiative now sounded like fracture. The anticipated dawn assault, once feared, began to appear less formidable. In war, weakness radiates quickly. Units that had prepared to withdraw to secondary lines adjusted in the opposite direction. Instead of conceding ground, they repositioned to exploit confusion. Artillery crews, initially ordered to hold fire until confirmation, were authorized to respond once engagement clarity emerged. The mood shifted from uncertainty to alert advantage. The enemy almost retreated until they realized what was happening. It is difficult to measure the precise moment when hesitation turns into opportunity. It can be as small as a fragment of intercepted communication, as brief as noticing irregular timing between volleys. But once clarity forms, even partially, momentum reverses. Across the field, the attacking force struggled to regain cohesion. Across from them, an opponent newly aware of disarray gathered strength. The tragedy deepened quietly. The assault that had been justified as preemptive now delivered the opposite effect. Instead of catching a defensive line off guard at dawn, it awakened a watchful adversary prepared to capitalize on visible error. When the first organized counterfire began to return across the darkness, it did not meet a unified front. It met scattered units already strained by internal confusion. Internal collapse had invited external aggression. As the horizon inched closer to pale grey, the outlines of terrain and bodies began to emerge more distinctly, and with approaching light came a truth neither side could fully avoid. Dawn did not arrive dramatically. It seeped across the horizon in thin layers of grey, pressing gently against the outlines of men and earth alike. Smoke that had hidden shapes during the night began to lifting veils. What had been shadow became form. What had been assumed became visible. The battlefield revealed itself without commentary. Units stood far from their intended positions. Lines that were meant to move in parallel had folded inward. Bodies lay where overlapping paths had converged. The terrain, so confusing in darkness, now exposed the simple truth of distance. Casualty counts began quietly. Names were spoken in low tones. Medics moved through the pale morning light with deliberate calm. Some soldiers stared outward, as if waiting for the night to return and hide what it exposed. The enemy line, once believed to be the primary obstacle, remained intact but not dominant. Their losses were present, but not decisive. The disproportion was difficult to ignore. Inside command tents, the process of reconstruction began immediately. Officers gathered scattered reports, attempting to impose order on the fragments. The first drafts of summaries avoided definitive language. There had been heavy engagement, resistance encountered earlier than expected. Night conditions complicated coordination. Those words felt safer than what they replaced. As more details emerged, patterns became harder to ignore. Friendly positions had overlapped prematurely. Signals had been misinterpreted. A flare, intended to guide, had triggered premature fire. None of these elements alone would explain the scale of loss. Together, they formed something more unsettling. But discomfort does not linger long in official language. By late morning, phrasing shifted. The battle had involved fierce resistance. The enemy had responded with unexpected strength. The night operation, though costly, demonstrated resilience under adverse conditions. The transformation was subtle yet decisive. Where confusion once stood, valor entered. Where miscalculation threatened credibility, courage provided stability. By noon, the story had already changed. It was not an overt fabrication. It was an adjustment of emphasis. The parts that felt chaotic were framed as unavoidable friction. The elements that suggested preventability were diluted into the fog of war. In structured reports, phrases like misidentification softened into operational strain. The night's collapse became its crucible. Yet, archived correspondence, uncovered years later, revealed something uncomfortable beneath that surface. Hours before the assault, advisory notes had indeed cautioned against advancing without daylight. They warned that terrain familiarity was limited. They stressed the risk of signal confusion. These notes were read, acknowledged, then overridden. The decision to move forward had not been blind. It had been deliberate. That distinction matters. They believed they were protecting morale, preserving trust, stabilizing the fragile balance between authority and accountability. In war, Admission of preventable failure can ripple outward unpredictably. So the language hardened into cohesion. The night became a testament to bravery under pressure, a costly push against a determined enemy. History often prefers courage over error. Courage is clean, it inspires, it consoles grieving families. Error unsettles, it demands reflection rather than reverence. But what happens when courage was never the central issue? What if the defining feature of that night was not the strength of those who fought, but the fragility of the decisions that placed them there? As sunlight strengthened and shadows receded, the battlefield seemed almost ordinary again. Wind moved across grass as it always had. Equipment was gathered, positions reassessed. The war pressed forward, indifferent to the nuances of one night's confusion. Yet beneath the official wording, beneath the speeches and structured reports, something unresolved lingered. To uncover it fully, one would have to step beyond summaries and into the private spaces where memory refused simplification, into letters written by trembling hands, into diaries never meant for publication, into files sealed not by conspiracy but by discomfort. The truth did not survive first in reports. It survived in ink. Long before historians opened boxes in quiet archive rooms, there were letters written by dim lantern light, folded carefully and slipped into pockets. Some were sealed and sent. Others were never mailed at all, found later, tucked inside uniforms, creased from being handled and reconsidered. They were not written for publication. They were written for someone waiting at home. In one, a soldier began by reassuring his mother that he was unharmed. The sentence is calm, almost routine. Then the tone shifts. He describes the night, not as a battle, but as confusion. He writes of firing at movement he could barely see, of shouting for identification, and hearing no clear reply. He mentions the moment he realized the voices crying out were familiar. Another letter, addressed to a wife, never reached its envelope. The handwriting is uneven. He explains that the darkness made distance impossible to judge. He insists there was no cowardice, only fear. He admits something he would never say aloud, that the first casualties may not have fallen to the enemy at all. The official report mentioned valor. The letters mentioned something else. Across multiple accounts, written independently by men positioned in different sectors of the field, the pattern repeats. Shots fired at silhouettes. Units drifting inward, signals mistaken for threat. The timeline described in these pages aligns with an unsettling detail. Confusion began before organized resistance from the opposing side. It is not rumor. It is repetition. The language in these letters is not accusatory. There is no dramatic blame. Instead, there is bewilderment. A quiet shame that surfaces between lines. One writer pauses mid-sentence, then resumes with an apology to the person reading, as if responsible for events far beyond his control. They do not describe glorious charges through disciplined ranks. They describe hearing a command echo from the wrong direction. They describe turning toward a flash of light and firing, because instinct felt faster than verification. They describe the terrible stillness after realizing what they had done. What makes these letters powerful is not their emotion alone. It is their consistency. Different voices, different phrasing, yet the same core memory. Darkness, misidentification, friendly fire preceding engagement. And yet, in the structured clarity of official summaries, there is no mention of this internal fracture. Reports speak of fierce resistance encountered early. They emphasize determination under pressure. They refer to night conditions complicating maneuver. Complicating maneuver is not the same as firing into your own line. Reading these personal accounts feels like leaning closer to a whisper that history chose not to amplify. The contrast sharpens slowly. On one side, institutional language smoothing uncertainty into resilience. On the other, private confession admitting fear and mistake. The men writing these letters were not attempting to correct the record. If so many survivors independently describe the same confusion, the same early crossfire, the same collapsing formation before enemy contact, why does the official narrative barely acknowledge it? The answer does not lie in absence of evidence. It lies in emphasis. What is repeated in private becomes muted in public. What feels shameful in memory becomes inconvenient, in summary. Holding these letters feels like stepping closer to the night than any report allows. The chaos they describe has texture. It breathes. It trembles between sentences. It feels human. If soldiers wrote with such unguarded honesty when no audience was watching, the question turns upward. What did officers record when they knew their words would shape memory, and how were those accounts adjusted before becoming permanent? If the letters were written in the language of memory, the reports were written in the language of permanence. The first drafts arrived unevenly, compiled from fragmented testimonies, gathered in the hours after sunrise. These early documents carry the imprint of confusion, still fresh in the mind. Phrases such as disorganized advance appeared without hesitation. There were references to misidentification in low visibility conditions. Positioning described as unclear. These words did not accuse. They simply attempted to map what had happened. In their raw form, the reports read almost like extension of the private letters, less emotional perhaps, but similarly uncertain. They documented timing that did not align, signals that failed to synchronize, units that converged unexpectedly. There was no polished narrative yet, only reconstruction. As the drafts moved upward through the chain of command, something began to shift. The wording softened first. Disorganized advance became disrupted formation. Misidentification transformed into engagement under limited visibility. Unclear positioning evolved into fluid maneuver conditions. None of these changes were dramatic. Each felt like refinement rather than revision. Then came the more decisive alteration. Where one early summary noted confusion prior to confirmed enemy contact, the finalized version described heavy resistance encountered earlier than anticipated. Where drafts mentioned overlapping friendly positions, the final report emphasized unexpected tactical opposition from opposing forces. The truth was not removed. It was rewritten. The progression is subtle enough that read quickly, it appears natural. War is chaotic. Reports are polished. Language matures as understanding deepens. That is the assumption. Yet when placed side by side, draft and final, the transformation becomes visible. Ambiguity gives way to clarity. Internal fault shifts outward. Even casualty figures experience slight adjustment. Initial tallies recorded losses higher by a margin that is not large enough to alarm, but significant enough to notice. Later publications reflect modestly reduced numbers. The reduction does not erase tragedy, but it calibrates it. It trims edges. It narrows the sense of scale. There is no evidence of dramatic instruction to conceal. No overt command to falsify. Instead, there is gradual alignment with a more coherent narrative. Institutional self-protection rarely announces itself. It operates through preference for stability. For authority, unshaken. Words, when chosen carefully, shape perception without appearing to distort it. Disorganization implies preventability. Heavy resistance implies inevitability. One invites scrutiny. The other commands respect. By the time the report reached its formal publication, the night had acquired dignity. It was framed as a hard-fought engagement under adverse conditions, a costly stand against an unexpectedly resolute enemy. The structure felt intact. The chain of decisions appeared purposeful. The chaotic error that soldiers described in letters began dissolving into something more respectable. No grand conspiracy was required for this transformation. Only incremental adjustments. A careful repositioning of emphasis. Accountability does not need to disappear to become less visible. It simply needs to move out of the center. The battlefield itself had not changed. The ground remained indifferent. But the story of what happened upon it now carried polish. The language stood straighter. The uncertainty softened. And yet, beneath those refined phrases, memory remained unchanged. Survivors did not experience the night as refined. They carried something less orderly than paperwork could contain. When the war eventually loosened its grip and soldiers returned home, the night did not follow them in visible form. There were ceremonies instead. Handshakes, speeches that praised endurance and sacrifice. Medals caught light in polished halls. Applause rose and settled like something rehearsed. Families wept with relief, holding men who had survived what others had not. Survival has a complicated texture. Some veterans accepted the public language offered to them. They repeated it when asked. They spoke of resistance, of chaos, of courage under pressure. Those words were not false. They simply did not reach far enough. Beneath them rested details, more difficult to explain. In quieter moments, long after uniforms had been folded away, memory returned without ceremony. It returned in fragments, the flare rising too early, the crack of rifles fired at the wrong direction, the sudden recognition of a familiar voice breaking in pain. These memories did not fit neatly into speeches. Shame complicates speech. Not the kind born of guilt for wrongdoing, but the heavier kind tied to helplessness. How does one explain that confusion? Not enemy brilliance shaped those first devastating minutes. How does one describe firing at a shadow and later realizing the shadow wore the same insignia? It was easier to let the official story stand. No order demanded silence. No authority threatened consequence. The quiet grew from within. To contradict the narrative felt disloyal to fallen comrades. To emphasize internal chaos risked diminishing shared sacrifice. So many veterans spoke carefully, adjusting their recollections to match what was already written. What if the hardest story to tell is the one where no one meant for it to happen? That question lingered, though rarely allowed. Years passed. Decades, interviews were conducted as historians sought living voices. By then, the immediacy of the night had softened, but not disappeared. In private conversations, away from ceremony and expectation, a different tone emerged. Some veterans admitted that they believed more men had fallen to miscommunication than to enemy fire. They said it quietly, sometimes after long pauses. They were not accusing commanders. They were not rewriting history out of anger. They were attempting, finally, to describe what they remembered. Their words carried no dramatic confrontation, only uncertainty still unresolved. They spoke of signals misunderstood, of crossfire spreading before clarity could form. They spoke of confusion that did not feel heroic, only tragic. The weight of collective silence becomes heavier when it is shared unconsciously. Each man assumed his discomfort belonged to him alone. Few realized how consistent their memories were across distance and time. Because no one publicly challenged the official account, it seemed intact. Survivors carried the night inward rather than outward. Memory, when complicated, often narrows instead of expands. The human mind searches for coherence, and when coherence cannot be found, it chooses restraint. It chooses fragments, rather than full reconstruction. History forgotten part, because those who lived it struggled to articulate what had occurred. It is easier to describe an enemy's strength than one's own miscalculation. Easier to frame loss as noble resistance than disoriented fire exchanged among friends. The silence was not enforced, it was internalized. As veterans aged and gatherings grew smaller, fewer opportunities remained for full retelling. Stories shortened, details blurred. The night, once vivid in sensation, became compressed even in personal recollection. Not erased, but softened. And yet, even as public memory thinned, traces survived elsewhere, in boxes tucked into attics, in interview tapes, stored without attention, in correspondence filed and forgotten. If the living struggled to speak plainly, perhaps the paper they left behind would one day do what they could not. Decades after the gunfire faded, the night remained where history had placed it, compressed, settled, undisturbed. It rested in textbooks as a paragraph, in military summaries as a brief notation, in public memory as a costly engagement under difficult conditions. No one was actively revisiting it. No one was arguing about it. It had achieved a kind of quiet permanence. The historian who disrupted that stillness was not searching for it. He had entered the archive room in pursuit of something else entirely. Supply chain correspondence from the same campaign, material considered mundane enough to avoid controversy. The air inside the archive carried the familiar scent of paper aging, gently, in containment. Boxes were labelled carefully. Files stacked without drama. There was nothing theatrical about the setting, nothing that suggested revelation. Patterns, however, reveal themselves slowly to those willing to look closely. As he cross-referenced dispatches sent during the week of the battle, he noticed small inconsistencies. Timestamps that did not align perfectly with published summaries. Communication logs referencing relay stations not mentioned in later reports. A casualty figure in one internal ledger, slightly higher than the number preserved in official histories. None of these details were dramatic. Each could be explained as clerical variance or routine adjustment. Yet together, they formed a faint outline of unease. The historian began pulling adjacent files, widening his search without consciously intending to challenge the accepted account. His focus shifted from logistics to operational correspondence, then to administrative memos. He worked quietly, making notes in the margins of his pad. The discrepancies were subtle, but persistent. Then came the misplaced document. Tucked inside a folder labeled Signal Adjustments, he found a memorandum dated 2 days after the battle. It referred not to supply concerns, but to what it described plainly as coordination breakdown during night advance. The language was not accusatory. It did not dramatize. It outlined communication delays, overlapping unit movement, and misinterpreted signals, contributing to early losses. There was no mention of overwhelming enemy resistance in that memo, no emphasis on tactical opposition. Instead, it recommended procedural changes for future night operations. One misplaced document raised a question no one had asked in decades. The historian searched for citations. Surely, such a memo would have been referenced in subsequent official analyses. Yet the mainstream accounts, the canonical histories and strategic reviews, made no direct acknowledgment of internal coordination failure. They referred only to adversity encountered under complex conditions. The memo was not classified under heavy restriction. It was not hidden behind extraordinary barriers. It was simply unreferenced. The destabilization did not occur as a dramatic revelation. It unfolded as realization. The accepted version of the night had always rested on selected emphasis. This document did not contradict the existence of courage or resistance. More files surfaced as he continued. Correspondence acknowledging communication gaps. Brief exchanges noting confusion in early engagement stages. None of these documents accused leadership directly. None called for public correction. They read like internal housekeeping. Quiet, but inconvenient. The crack forming in the surface of accepted history was narrow at first. Not a fracture wide enough to topple monuments, but sufficient to let light through. The battle had not been misrepresented entirely. It had been streamlined. If these documents existed, resting calmly in archive boxes, the question deepened. Why had they never entered the broader historical consensus? Institutions rarely forget in the way individuals do. They do not lose memory through age or distraction. They preserve it carefully, filing away correspondence, reports, memos, and personal accounts with meticulous attention. Military archives in particular are vast reservoirs of detail. Nothing is thrown away lightly. Almost everything survives on paper. But survival and prominence are not the same. An archive is not a story. Which documents rise into textbooks and which remain quietly catalogued depends not only on availability but on interpretation, and interpretation depends on preference. As the historian traced the threads of that night, he began to see how the shaping had occurred. Early secondary accounts leaned heavily on formal summaries, already refined through several layers of review. Later historians cited those secondary accounts, trusting them as established authority. The narrative settled into form, not because contradictory evidence was hidden, but because it required extra effort to retrieve. Controversial findings often remain technically accessible, while practically invisible. A document can sit undisturbed for decades, not because someone locked it away, but because no one made it central. The phrase coordination breakdown appears clearly in archived memos. Yet, in published histories, that phrasing dissolves into operational strain. The shift does not involve deletion, it involves prioritization. No one erased the truth. They simply chose not to center it. This dynamic becomes clearer when examining correspondence between high-ranking officials in the war's aftermath. In one exchange, written months after the battle, there is cautious discussion about framing. The language is measured, restrained. It does not suggest deception. Instead, it weighs public perception, Emphasizing internal confusion, one-letter notes, might risk undermining confidence in strategic leadership during a sensitive reconstruction period. The concern was not accuracy, it was stability. Sacrifice unites. Miscalculation unsettles. By foregrounding courage under fire and backgrounding early coordination failure, the institution preserved morale while maintaining documentation of internal lessons elsewhere. The evidence remained intact inside filing cabinets and sealed folders. It simply did not migrate into speeches, commemorations, or textbook narratives. Textbooks, after all, depend on clarity. They distill complexity into digestible chapters. They cannot, or will not, amplify every inconvenient nuance. Authors rely on established accounts. Established accounts rely on earlier publications. A chain forms, each link reinforcing the previous one. Over time, repetition hardens into consensus. The battle's legacy, therefore, did not become one of miscalculation because such evidence was absent. It became one of sacrifice because sacrifice offered coherence. It felt dignified. It allowed families to anchor grief in meaning rather than confusion. The subtlety of this process is what makes it powerful. There was no dramatic rewriting committee. No midnight shredding of documents. Instead, there was a quiet gravitation toward what felt safer to emphasize. A mission, in this case, required no censorship. It required only preference. When institutions curate their own memory, they rarely aim to deceive. They aim to endure, to present continuity, to protect legitimacy. In doing so, they may leave uncomfortable details intact, but peripheral. For decades, the night remained structured by that peripheral framing. Yet archival discovery does more than revise isolated facts. Once reintroduced, those sideline details begin to reshape the meaning of the event itself, stretching its implications across generations in ways the original curators never fully anticipated. The maps did not change because of that night. Borders remained steady. No capital fell. No decisive campaign pivoted on its outcome. If measured only in territory gained or lost, the event appears minor, almost incidental, and yet its shadow stretches farther than the lines on a battlefield suggest. History often measures consequence in land, in treaties, in visible shifts of power. But influence sometimes moves in quieter directions. It seeps into doctrine, into training manuals, into procedures, rewritten without ceremony. It alters habits rather than headlines. In the years that followed the night's confusion, internal military reviews multiplied. Committees convened not to revisit the narrative, but to examine communication systems and night maneuver protocols. Signals were standardized. Redundancies were mandated. Identification procedures were reinforced with stricter timing guidelines. Training exercises increasingly emphasized visibility limitations and cross-unit coordination. These reforms did not appear suddenly or loudly. They were framed as modernization, as adaptation to evolving conditions. Official documentation described them as lessons drawn from cumulative wartime experience. Cumulative experience is a comfortable phrase within internal memoranda. However, the language is more specific. It references the risks exposed during a recent night operation. It highlights failures in signal clarity and the danger of overlapping formations under limited visibility. The phrasing is cautious, but unmistakable. The final reveal lies in this quiet acknowledgment. Reforms addressing night maneuver communication were introduced shortly after the battle, yet no formal connection was drawn publicly between those changes and the event itself. The night shaped improvement, but its origin remained muted. Publicly, the battle endured as an example of costly determination. Privately, it became a case study in procedural vulnerability. The paradox lingers. The event was minimized in narrative, while amplified in practice. What if the most influential nights in history are the ones barely remembered? There is something unsettling about that possibility. We tend to believe that influence travels through visibility, that lessons are learned through acknowledgment. Yet here, change unfolded without open attribution, manuals adjusted, officers trained differently, communication infrastructure strengthened, all without reopening the story that necessitated those shifts. Perhaps institutions understood the lesson, even if they hesitated to declare it openly. Reform can coexist with silence. This duality reframes the meaning of memory. An event does not need to occupy textbooks to leave a mark. It can imprint itself on behavior quietly, reshaping routines, long after the speeches fade. And yet, absence in narrative carries its own consequence. When a lesson is absorbed, but not fully articulated, its emotional resonance weakens. The technical fix may prevent repetition, but the deeper humility required to confront error remains underdeveloped. The Knight's shadow, therefore, extends across two domains. In one, doctrine improved. In another, collective understanding narrowed. The men who survived carried the memory within them. The institution adjusted its systems. The public, meanwhile, remembered only sacrifice. This layered influence invites a broader reflection. If one overlooked night could quietly alter procedure without altering story, how many other compressed events have shaped the present in similar ways? How many operational refinements trace their lineage to moments barely acknowledged? History, when examined closely, begins to feel less like a clean timeline and more like sediment, layers of impact accumulating without uniform visibility. The battlefield, where that confusion unfolded, remains unchanged by time's indifference. Grass grows, wind passes, yet the imprint of that hour endures in practices taught to soldiers who never heard its details. The paradox deepens rather than resolves. Public memory can forget while institutional memory adapts. Silence can coexist with correction. If this single night reshaped practice without reshaping narrative, the question broadens beyond one event. What larger forces ensured that its official version so firmly? What pressures outside the battlefield cemented the story into its simplified form, protecting it from deeper scrutiny? To answer that, the lens must widen again, beyond archives and doctrine, into the political climate that followed the war, where unity often outweighed nuance and footnotes were preferred over lessons. When the war finally ended, the silence that followed felt heavier than gunfire. Trains carried soldiers home to stations, crowded with relief and restrained tears. Flags were lowered from battlefield posts and raised again over city squares. Governments shifted their attention from strategy to reconstruction, from advance to repair. Factories were retooled, bridges rebuilt, speeches prepared. Public grief settled into national reflection. Yet behind ceremonies and carefully composed addresses, another conversation unfolded, quieter, less visible, but no less decisive. The question was no longer how to win. It was how to remember. In cabinet rooms and closed-door meetings, leaders sat with reports stacked neatly before them. The public was exhausted. Families counted absences at dinner tables. Trust in leadership, though not shattered, felt delicate. In such moments, stability becomes currency. Admitting that thousands of lives had been lost to avoidable confusion would not simply correct a record. It could reopen wounds still raw. It could invite doubt not only about one decision, but about the integrity of the entire war effort. Leaders understood that memory shapes the future as much as victory shapes maps. The dilemma was not abstract. Accountability or unity. Transparency or cohesion. In fragile seasons, the language is restrained, almost bureaucratic. One memorandum cautions against emphasizing operational miscalculations that might undermine institutional credibility during a period of national recovery. Protecting institutional credibility sounds neutral, even prudent, yet it carries weight. It suggests that narrative itself can become infrastructure. The battle's night within these exchanges is described as a necessary risk under complex conditions. The phrase smooths edges. Necessary suggests inevitability. Complex implies shared uncertainty rather than preventable error. Gradually, the framing settles. The event becomes sacrifice, not misjudgment. Valor. No one in these rooms likely believed they were rewriting truth. They believed they were preserving morale. Nations emerging from war depend on shared meaning. Shared meaning depends on coherent stories. The temptation to simplify does not arise from malice. It arises from fear of fragmentation. In peacetime, wars are not only remembered, they are edited. The editing does not involve erasing archives or silencing witnesses. It operates through emphasis. Speeches highlight resilience. Memorial plaques speak of bravery. Official commemorations center courage against opposition. The internal memoranda remain filed, intact but peripheral. Gradually, repetition hardens the selected framing. Newspapers echo the official language. Early historians, writing within this stabilized atmosphere, adopt the same tone. The night becomes emblematic of sacrifice demanded by war's complexity. Its internal confusion drifts further from the center of attention. This is how narrative solidifies. Not through lies, but through strategic framing, through deciding which details deserve spotlight and which remain in shadow, through understanding that public faith can be as vulnerable as any front line. For the citizens listening to speeches beneath clean skies, the story feels complete. The war ended, lessons learned. Sacrifice honored. Few sense the tension embedded within those summaries. Yet, once leadership shapes the memory from above, that framing does not remain confined to cabinet rooms. It travels outward, influencing historians, educators, and the stories passed quietly from one generation to the next. By the time the first comprehensive histories of the war began to appear, the language had already been polished. Historians, working with the best sources available to them, leaned heavily on official reports and endorsed summaries. Those documents carried authority. They bore signatures, seals, timestamps. They felt stable. Few scholars doubted them. The early volumes were ambitious. Thick books bound in sober colors, promising definitive accounts. Within their chapters, the war unfolded through campaigns and counteroffensives, negotiations and turning points. The night in question appeared as one moment among many, costly, difficult, resolved. The phrasing echoed what had been established in official memoranda. The assault met heavy resistance. The troops demonstrated resilience under adverse night conditions. Casualties were significant, but reflective of determined opposition. The structure felt coherent. It fit neatly into the broader arc of hardship and endurance. What the textbooks did not mention felt almost incidental at first. There was no reference to friendly units converging unexpectedly. No discussion of flares misread as incoming fire. No acknowledgment of advisory notes dismissed hours before engagement. The chaotic texture preserved in private letters dissolved into two efficient lines. Narratives cascade quietly. On an respected publication becomes a citation for the next. That citation becomes reinforcement. Over time, interpretation hardens into consensus. The event's framing grows sturdier with repetition. Students encounter the summary in classrooms, accept it as settled fact, and carry it forward unexamined. The transformation is subtle, but profound. A night once described by survivors as disoriented and fragmented becomes emblematic of courage under pressure. The messy edges are trimmed for readability. Clarity is prioritized over complexity. Some stories disappear not because they are false, but because they complicate the narrative. There is an anecdote, preserved in correspondence between editors, that captures this process in miniature. An early draft of a comprehensive war history reportedly contained a detailed passage discussing communication breakdown during the night advance. It referenced internal memoranda and survivor accounts, presenting a layered view of the operation's failure. In later editions, that passage no longer appeared. The explanation offered was not ideological. It was structural clarity. The chapter required tightening. Redundancies needed trimming. The broader strategic arc demanded focus. Structural clarity can be decisive. Length constraints act as selective filters. When an author must condense thousands of pages into a manageable volume, choices are inevitable. What remains often aligns with a dominant framing already in circulation. Details that challenge coherence are the first to fall away. The removal did not spark controversy. Few readers noticed the absence. Most had never encountered the fuller description to begin with. The consensus remained intact. History does not compress events because it hates truth. It compresses because it prefers clarity. Complexity strains narrative flow. Ambiguity resists neat resolution. In striving for intelligibility, nuance becomes expendable. And yet, compression carries consequence. Students who read only the streamlined account internalize not just facts, but tone. They learn to associate the night with resilience rather than vulnerability. They absorb a lesson shaped more by emphasis than by full context. As decades pass, that simplified framing settles into cultural memory. It influences how future generations conceptualize not only that battle, but warfare itself. If public understanding was gently molded through repetition and refinement, what effect did that sanitized memory have on those who later studied these histories in military academies, preparing to make decisions of their own? Public memory settled around the night like smooth stone, polished and permanent. In speeches, it remained a testament to resolve under difficulty. In textbooks, it remained compressed and dignified. Yet behind that stable surface, movement continued. Within months of the battle, internal reviews expanded quietly. Committees convened not to assign blame, but to examine procedure. The language of these meetings was practical, restrained. How can communication be fortified during night operations? How can identification errors be reduced? How can overlapping formations be prevented? The tone was not defensive, it was corrective. Night maneuver protocols were rewritten in deliberate detail. Signal systems were redesigned to include layered verification. Before engagement, identification procedures were strengthened, requiring confirmation signals prior to concentrated fire. Communication redundancies became standard practice, rather than contingency. Relay stations were repositioned, visual markers modified. On paper, these appeared as routine modernization measures. But their timing spoke clearly. The reforms came quickly. The admission never did. Institutions may guard narrative carefully, but they cannot afford to ignore operational failure. No organization tasked with survival can allow vulnerability to remain unexamined. The cost of repetition would be too high. Training manuals published in the years that followed reflected this shift. Chapters dedicated to night engagement grew thicker. Case studies described the dangers of misinterpreted signals and cross-unit drift under limited visibility. Exercises simulated coordination breakdown and forced officers to respond under constrained information. The language used in these manuals echoed the archived memoranda uncovered by the historian. References to early engagement confusion. Warnings against premature fire triggered by ambiguous signals. The conditions matched the fatal night with precise familiarity. Yet, the battle itself was never cited directly. There was no chapter titled Lessons from that night. No explicit acknowledgment tying reform to event. The silence felt intentional, not denial, but containment. The institution absorbed the lesson, while preventing the origin from re-entering public discourse. This duality reveals something unsettling and strangely disciplined. Systems can learn without confessing. They can adapt without revisiting memory. They can translate error into policy while leaving narrative untouched. The men who fell during those first devastating minutes did not receive formal recognition as catalysts for reform. Their loss entered doctrine silently. Future soldiers trained under safer protocols without hearing the story that shaped them. There is a paradox in that quiet influence. The dead shaped future safety, but their lesson remained unnamed. Influence does not always announce itself through acknowledgment. It flows through correction, through incremental change, through procedures strengthened without visible origin. To an outsider, the reforms might appear as natural evolution. Only those who trace the timeline closely would notice how sharply policy pivoted after that particular night. In this way, the event achieved a strange permanence, not in statues or anniversaries, but in revised radio frequencies, standardized flare codes, and reinforced identification drills. The tragedy became infrastructure. Viewers looking for dramatic confrontation will not find it here. There is no public reckoning, no formal apology. Instead, there is a quiet shift in systems, as though the institution whispered to itself, "Never again like that." Yet, because the lesson was never fully named, its moral weight remained diluted, procedure improved, understanding remained partial. And silence does not remain confined within institutions. It seeps outward, shaping culture itself into films that emphasize sacrifice over confusion, into speeches that honor bravery without questioning decision, into a national mythology that prefers clarity to doubt. Time did what time often does. It carried the night out of the realm of memory and into the realm of story. Years after the war, when the first films began to dramatize its battles, the night returned in flickering light across cinema screens. Actors moved through carefully designed shadows. Music swelled at moments of danger. Dialogue sharpened fear into purpose. The audience watched men stand shoulder to shoulder, advancing despite overwhelming resistance. There was tension. There was loss. But there was also structure. On screen, the battle unfolded with clarity. The enemy's position was visible. The threat was external and cohesive. When soldiers fell, they fell facing forward, unified against opposition. The confusion of darkness became cinematic suspense rather than operational collapse. Public commemorations followed a similar pattern. Speeches delivered beneath polished monuments honored courage under fire. The language emphasized bravery in impossible conditions, resilience in the face of unexpected strength. Flowers were placed. Names were read aloud. No one was lying. The men had been brave. They had endured fear and uncertainty. They had stood where they were ordered to stand, yet the framing subtly shifted the center of gravity. Chaos moved to the periphery. Courage moved to the center. Early drafts tell a quieter story. In archived correspondence between writers and editors, there are hints of scenes that did not survive final production. A screenplay once included a sequence in which units mistakenly fire toward their own silhouettes, only to realize too late what they have done. In later revisions, that scene was shortened, softened, or removed entirely. The reason offered was pacing. Too much confusion, one note suggested, might dilute emotional focus. Memoirs tell a similar tale. Initial manuscripts sometimes included fuller descriptions of overlapping formations and misinterpreted flares. Published versions, shaped by editorial counsel, emphasized endurance. Instead, details of crossfire receded into single sentences. Chaos is harder to honor than courage. Storytelling thrives on contrast. Hero and adversary, danger and triumph. Audiences seek coherence, especially when confronting trauma. A narrative that centers confusion risks unsettling the very meaning the story attempts to preserve. As these films and books reached broader audiences, the night gradually assumed symbolic weight. It became shorthand for sacrifice, for commitment under extraordinary strain. Its edges were smoothed not to deceive, but to make it bearable. Societies emerging from trauma crave narratives that hold together. Complexity can feel like threat. To dwell too long on preventable error can erode collective confidence. Myth-making does not always grow from denial. It grows from the need for continuity. The myth that formed around the night was not false. It was selective. It illuminated bravery and dimmed miscalculation. It preserved dignity while reducing ambiguity. For viewers, the story felt complete. There were protagonists and obstacles. There was cost and consequence. There was something to admire. Yet beneath that admiration lingered unanswered questions, faint but persistent. When storytelling chooses clarity over chaos, what becomes of those who remember the confusion more vividly than the heroism? How does simplified narrative shape not just public memory, but personal identity? If culture reframed the night into something streamlined and symbolic, the next layer of inquiry turns inward. How did those surviving soldiers live inside a story that had grown larger and cleaner than the reality they carried within? The legend settled over the survivors slowly. Like dust that gathers without announcement, decades passed. Uniforms were folded into drawers, medals placed inside small wooden boxes. Photographs framed moments frozen in youth. Faces stern, eyes steady, insignias clear. Communities invited them to speak at ceremonies. Schools asked them to share memories of courage and resilience. Many veterans learned how to speak within the accepted narrative. They described the cold, the fear, the sudden eruption of gunfire. They spoke of holding position and pushing forward. Their words were not lies. They were simply incomplete. What do you do when the story that honors you doesn't feel entirely true? Some men felt no conflict. They accepted the framing offered to them. In their minds, bravery had been real, regardless of the confusion that preceded it. Sacrifice had meaning, even if its cause had been tangled in error. Others hesitated. In one recorded interview, preserved decades later, a veteran sits beneath soft lighting, medals resting against his jacket. The interviewer asks him about the night. He nods, steady at first. He repeats familiar phrases: heavy resistance, difficult conditions, a fight under darkness. His tone remains composed. Then he pauses. There was confusion that night, he says quietly. The word lingers. He shifts in his seat. He adjusts his posture. Then he returns to the safer narrative. It was a hard battle. We did what we had to do. That brief hesitation carries weight. It is not defiance. It is not accusation. It is the friction between memory and myth, between loyalty to comrades and loyalty to accuracy. For many survivors, the night became sacred. Sacred not because it was pure, but because it was shared. To disturb its public framing felt like disturbing the memory of those who had fallen. Silence became a form of respect. And yet, silence can isolate. When collective memory elevates heroism and dims confusion, individuals who recall the latter may feel alone in their recollection. They assume their discomfort is personal rather than common. Each man believes he alone carries the uneasy detail of crossfire and misdirected signals. Collective memory protects. It offers stability. It binds communities through shared meaning. But it can also narrow space for nuance, leaving little room for those whose memories do not align perfectly with celebration. In this way, the night became both sacred and distorted. Sacred in ceremony, distorted in compression. As years moved forward, fewer voices remained to complicate the legend. Veterans aged. Interviews grew shorter. Public memory condensed into anniversary speeches and documentary clips. What had once been debated quietly in private rooms now lived in simplified retrospectives. With each passing generation, recollections softened. Details faded. Compression carries consequences. When memory narrows, what remains often feels solid and uncontested. But the absence of friction does not guarantee completeness. It may signal only that those who held conflicting layers are no longer present to voice them. As the witnesses gradually disappeared, the night grew cleaner in public memory, until it seemed almost seamless. And yet, beneath that seamlessness, traces endured elsewhere. In boxes unopened, in transcripts unreviewed, in files waiting beyond the reach of ceremony. When a tragedy is smoothed into something digestible, it becomes easier to carry. The sharp edges are filed down. The uncomfortable pauses disappear. What remains feels stable, coherent, almost reassuring. The story can be told in classrooms without hesitation. It can be honored in speeches without complication. It fits. But clarity can conceal as much as it reveals. When future leaders study the past, they rely on what has been preserved and emphasized. They trace patterns from earlier conflicts, searching for guidance. They look for examples of courage, of decisive action under pressure. They analyze strategy diagrams and casualty charts. They learn to recognize strength and opposition. What they do not always encounter is fragility. If a battle is remembered primarily as a noble stand against overwhelming resistance, its deeper vulnerability fades from view. The lesson absorbed is one of endurance, not hesitation, of resolve, not misinterpretation. Yet the crucial error of that night did not lie in a lack of bravery. It lay in incomplete information meeting impatience in darkness. Oversimplification does not erase lessons entirely. It redirects them. Years after reform strengthened signal systems and night protocols, other conflicts unfolded under different skies. New generations of officers applied updated procedures. Technology improved. Communication became faster. And yet, in scattered reports across later campaigns, a familiar pattern reappeared. Under limited visibility conditions, units misread positioning. Signals were interpreted too quickly. Confidence hardened where uncertainty should have paused action. The equipment was modernized. The terrain changed. But the structure of the era echoed that earlier night. The reforms had addressed mechanics. They had strengthened systems. What they had not fully restored was emphasis on psychological vulnerability. Public narratives had centered resilience, not risk. As a result, the deeper lesson, The humility required when information is partial remained underdeveloped. When mistakes are hidden behind honor, they become harder to recognize when they return. This is the quiet cost of simplified history. It is not that it deceives blatantly. It reframes. It comforts. It allows societies to move forward without dwelling too long on discomfort. But, in doing so, it can dull sensitivity to the conditions that produced failure in the first place. When history becomes comfortable, it also becomes incomplete. The incompleteness does not announce itself loudly. It does not issue warning. It simply leaves gaps where caution should reside. It encourages future decision makers to interpret silence as stability, to see momentum where there may only be confusion waiting in shadow. The night at the center of this story was not unique in its structure. It was only one instance where darkness, pressure, and interpretation converged. Its compression made it easier to honor, but compression also made it easier to misread. History does not lie loudly. It softens. It edits edges until they feel safe to touch. It reshapes chaos into coherence. It replaces uncomfortable complexity with manageable clarity, and in doing so, it leaves subtle lessons scattered across time, waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to see the pattern. If one night could be reduced so easily, if its lessons could be absorbed without being fully spoken, then perhaps it is not alone. Perhaps across decades and wars, there are other compressed nights, each influential, each simplified, each resting quietly beneath more celebrated headlines. To understand the pattern fully, we must widen the lens beyond this single battlefield and search for the echoes elsewhere, where other forgotten hours shaped the present without ever claiming center stage. Years after the battlefield, grass had reclaimed the scars of that night. Its name appeared again, not in headlines or speeches, but in lecture halls. Military academies, polished and precise, carried forward the memory in structured form. Young cadets sat beneath bright lights, notebooks open, studying campaigns from the war with disciplined attention. Maps were projected across clean white screens. Arrows traced movement. Timelines were listed with careful order. Objectives, outcomes, consequences. The battle in question occupied a segment within a broader strategic overview. It was positioned between other engagements that appeared more decisive, more visually dramatic. Cadets memorized the outcome. Significant casualties during a night maneuver encountered heavy opposition, ultimately preserved strategic footing. The phrasing felt clinical, detached. Something was missing. The internal confusion, once described in letters and quiet interviews, had been condensed into operational terminology. Coordination challenges, communication strain, unanticipated resistance. The vocabulary sounded technical, controlled, almost sterile. It carried no echo of panicked crossfire or overlapping formations in darkness. Institutional memory often protects itself by abstraction. Human error becomes procedural adjustment. Fear becomes friction. Chaos becomes complexity. In classrooms, instructors emphasize the importance of redundancy in signal transmission and careful positioning during low-visibility operations. They reference the battle as an example of the risks inherent in night advancement, but rarely lingered on its fragile opening hour. The focus remained on adaptation rather than misjudgment. The next generation studied the battle, but not the part that mattered most. In one declassified training critique, preserved quietly among faculty archives, an instructor noted this omission directly. He observed that the official case study understated the scale of communication collapse during the initial phase. He suggested that future officers should examine the psychological vulnerability of decision-making under uncertain visibility. That critique did not appear in the finalized curriculum. The comment remained in a margin, acknowledged but unintegrated. The echo of that night continued, but faintly. It survived in the structure of new communication protocols and in revised identification procedures. It lived in footnotes and cautionary phrases. Yet its full texture, the human fragility behind those changes, remained absent from formal emphasis. Tragedy became infrastructure. Confusion became doctrine. Names disappeared into standardized terminology. For the cadets, the lesson absorbed was technical rather than emotional. They learned to anticipate signal distortion. They practiced overlapping coverage drills. They simulated breakdown scenarios in controlled environments. The system improved. But systems evolve through partial truths as well as complete ones. The abstraction served a purpose. It maintained clarity. It ensured cohesion. It preserved confidence in the institution's capacity to correct itself. Yet, abstraction also distances. It separates consequence from cause. The young officers left those classrooms believing they understood the battle. In many ways they did. They grasped its operational implications. They memorized its outcome. They could recite its place in the war's sequence. What they did not fully encounter was the vulnerability at its core. The impatience, the misinterpretation, the quiet decision that shifted dawn into darkness. As the curriculum carried forward a refined version of that night, memory beyond the institution continued differently. Outside academies and lecture halls, in homes and family gatherings, fragments of the night survived in less organized forms. If the military absorbed only fragments of the lesson within doctrine, what happened beyond its walls? In the families and communities who carried memory without institutional language to contain it. In quiet living rooms far from lecture halls and parade grounds, the night lived differently. Photographs rested in wooden frames along mantels, their glass slightly clouded with age. Uniformed faces stared outward from another era, young and composed. Medals hung inside shadow boxes. Certificates, stamped and signed, spoke of valor under fire. The words on those certificates were certain, but family memory rarely felt that certain. Letters preserved in drawers carried a softer tone. Reassurances written in careful script, yes, but also pauses between lines. Subtle phrases about limited visibility, about signals that seemed unclear, about fear that did not belong neatly inside heroism. Sometimes the hints appeared not in the letter itself, but in the way stories were told at the table. A grandfather, asked about the battle, might nod and describe heavy resistance. He would recount standing firm with his unit. Then, as if turning down the volume inside his own mind, he would mention darkness and confusion. The words would hang in the air briefly. Someone would ask what he meant. He would wave it away. It was a long time ago. Things were complicated. He would never return to that phrase. Sometimes the most honest version of history is whispered at the kitchen table. For families, the fracture between public honor and private recollection felt subtle but persistent. They attended commemorations. They listened to speeches praising resolve. They felt pride. And yet, they also carried quieter details. Memories that did not fit easily inside ceremony. One daughter, sorting through her father's belongings after his death, discovered two versions of the same letter. The mailed copy described enduring a fierce enemy under impossible night conditions. The draft, folded separately and never sent, included lines crossed out in pencil. It described firing toward movement that later proved familiar. It questioned whether confusion had spread before resistance appeared. Those lines were not accusations. They were doubt. She placed the 2 pages side by side and felt the small distance between them widen. Why had he removed those sentences? Was he protecting her? Protecting himself? Silence, in this context, had not been ordered. It had been chosen. And once chosen, it became inherited. Children, they learn to read pauses as much as words. Memory survives in gestures, in incomplete sentences, in the way someone looks away when recalling a flare lighting the sky too soon. Families often carried pride and uncertainty together. They honored the sacrifice without fully understanding its structure. They felt gratitude and an undercurrent of something unresolved. As years passed, fewer voices remained to elaborate on those fragments. Grandparents aged, stories shortened. What had once been whispered over late-night conversations condensed into single phrases repeated at reunions. Darkness and confusion. The words lingered without explanation. If memory survives informally in living rooms and attics, carried through drafts and pauses, what happens when time finally erases the living witnesses entirely? Does the fragile truth fade with them, or does it transform into something else, waiting to be uncovered again by those willing to listen closely to what was never fully said? Time has a way of thinning sound. Voices that once carried across rooms with quiet intensity begin to soften, then falter, then disappear altogether. Veterans, who once hesitated at certain questions, grow older. Their pauses become longer, their stories shorter. Eventually, even those pauses are gone. Diaries are boxed carefully and donated to archives. Letters are scanned, catalogued, placed into climate-controlled silence. Oral history recordings sit on digital shelves, labelled with dates and fading names. The human presence that gave those words warmth recedes into metadata. As the number of living witnesses declines, something subtle shifts in public narrative. Complexity requires advocates. When those who remember fragility firsthand are no longer present to complicate ceremony, simplification accelerates almost effortlessly. History grows quieter, not through conspiracy, but through biology. When the witnesses are gone, who speaks for the details? The question is less dramatic than it sounds. It does not imply betrayal. It implies absence. In the years following the death of the last surviving officer, directly involved in that night, a new edition of the official campaign summary was released. It was marketed as updated and streamlined, reflecting improved scholarship and refined archival integration. The language was concise. In previous editions, there had been passing acknowledgment of coordination strain during early engagement, a cautious phrase noting communication challenges under limited visibility. In the newest edition, even that phrasing was reduced. The night's description shortened by several lines. The emphasis shifted entirely toward resistance, encountered, and sacrifice endured. The adjustment did not trigger headlines. Few noticed. The officer who might have raised an eyebrow was no longer alive to do so. Memory fades not only because it is edited, but because those who feel its friction are no longer here to resist the smoothing. Silence expands naturally, without living contradiction. Narratives tend toward coherence. Documents remain in archives, but their interpretation grows lighter when not anchored by testimony. A historian may stumble upon internal memos decades later, but public consensus rarely bends easily once established. This is not erasure in the dramatic sense. It is erosion. Like wind wearing stone, time rounds edges gradually. Details grow faint. Context recedes. Future generations inherit a version already shaped by prior simplifications. The battlefield itself persists unchanged by these shifts. Grass continues to rise and fall with seasons. Rain erases footprints no one can see. The land does not mourn its own compression, but human history does. What remains when witnesses become absent is a story lean enough to fit inside textbooks, inside speeches, inside commemorative plaques. It feels resolved. It feels complete. It feels perhaps easier. Yet beneath that ease lies a deeper discomfort. If this night, once thick with confusion, hesitation, and preventable loss, could narrow into a paragraph as its witnesses disappeared, what does that suggest about other events across other wars? How many single nights altered lives and shaped policy, only to be condensed into lines too brief to carry their complexity? How many hours, dense with uncertainty and misjudgment, now exist as tidy summaries? The pattern feels less isolated now. It stretches across time, across battlefields, unnamed and named alike. It suggests that memory's compression may be less exception and more habit. And if this habit repeats, then perhaps the night we have been following is not unique in its quiet transformation. To see that clearly, the lens must widen once more. Beyond one war, beyond one landscape, toward other forgotten hours scattered across history, each simplified, each influential, each barely remembered today. When the lens widens, the night we have followed begins to feel less singular. Across different wars, different uniforms, different maps, there are other entries in official records that sound strangely familiar. A night maneuver resulted in heavy losses. An engagement under limited visibility produced unexpected casualties. Units encountered resistance earlier than anticipated. The phrasing shifts slightly with era and language, yet the structure remains consistent. In one conflict decades later, troops advanced under darkness to secure what commanders believed was an unguarded ridge. Textbooks summarize the event in a line or two, emphasizing determination under harsh condition. Archived dispatches reveal confusion over signal timing and overlapping units, firing across converging paths. In another war, fought on entirely different terrain, night artillery coordination faltered after a flare was misread as a prearranged signal. The subsequent exchange of fire is recorded publicly as heavy engagement with entrenched opposition. Declassified summaries describe something more fragile, fragmented communication, and misinterpreted cues in low visibility. It was not the only night. It was simply one of many. The documentary shifts here from investigation into pattern recognition. Each case, when isolated, appears tragic but contained. When placed side by side, a structural repetition emerges. Limited visibility. Fragmented communication. Assumptions hardened into action. Silence mistaken for stability. Declassified reports from multiple eras contain near identical phrasing to describe these events. Unexpected engagement under reduced visibility. Coordination challenges during night operations. Early resistance encountered. The language echoes across decades, like a refrain. What changes are the names of commanders, the design of uniforms, the technology in their hands. What remains is the human response to uncertainty in darkness. The repetition is not conspiratorial. It is cognitive. In daylight, errors are visible before they escalate. Information arrives incomplete. Sound travels unevenly. A flicker of light can mean guidance or threat. Decisions compress into instinct. Again and again, across conflicts separated by geography and ideology, similar sequences unfold. Units advance under pressure. Reports lag behind reality. Signals overlap. Assumptions become actions before verification catches up. Yet each time, official summaries condense the chaos into digestible phrasing. Heavy losses, fierce resistance, difficult terrain. History does not rush past just one night. It rushes past many. The pattern becomes harder to ignore when examined collectively. It suggests that the vulnerability we observed earlier was not isolated to one command structure or one generation of soldiers. It reflects something more universal about human decision making when vision is limited and momentum feels necessary. The viewer begins to sense a quiet system beneath the surface of separate events. Different wars, similar structures, different decades, identical summaries. The tragedy lies not only in the losses themselves, but in the compression that follows. Each night becomes a line in a chapter, already crowded with other campaigns. The specificity dissolves into terminology. Seeing this repetition does not diminish individual sacrifice. Instead, it deepens understanding. It suggests that vulnerability in darkness is not anomaly, but recurring condition. If this pattern repeats across eras, if night consistently magnifies human assumption and misinterpretation, then perhaps the question is no longer about any single battle. It becomes broader. Why do humans struggle so consistently with decisions made in darkness? Darkness alters more than vision. It reshapes judgment. On a battlefield, reduced visibility limits the ability to confirm what the eye believes it sees. Shapes distort. Distance compresses. Movement carries ambiguity. But the deeper transformation happens in the mind. When information thins, interpretation grows louder. In darkness, we do not see less. We assume more. Human cognition resists gaps. When signals arrive fragmented, the mind fills missing pieces instinctively. A burst of sound becomes confirmed resistance. A stretch of silence feels like secure progress. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, so interpretation supplies clarity, where evidence cannot. Fear and impatience amplify one another under these conditions. Fear demands immediate action. Impatience rejects delay. Together, they compress decision-making into reaction. Leaders facing partial reports often equate absence of retreat with forward movement. They interpret noise as confirmation of engagement rather than confusion. They prefer decisive framing over prolonged doubt. This psychological pattern extends beyond war. Modern research into decision-making under low information conditions reveals consistent tendencies. Studies examining crisis leadership, emergency response teams, and high-pressure corporate environments show that when data is incomplete, individuals frequently overestimate coherence. They act confidently on assumptions formed within milliseconds. They misread silence as stability. They misinterpret fragmented signals as consistent narrative. In controlled simulations, Decision-makers presented with ambiguous scenarios often choose the first plausible explanation rather than waiting for clarity. They move forward to regain a sense of control, even when patience might preserve safety. Ancient battlefields and modern boardrooms share this invisible architecture. Emergency coordinators responding to disasters sometimes dispatch resources based on preliminary reports later revealed incomplete. Corporate leaders announce expansions during volatile markets, interpreting temporary calm as sustained growth. Crisis managers mistake absence of warning for absence of threat. Darkness becomes metaphor. It no longer refers solely to moonless terrain. It refers to informational blindness, to moments when knowledge is partial, but action feels urgent, to environments where perception outruns verification. The tragedy described earlier now feels less confined to one place or era. It resembles a broader human pattern. Under pressure, with incomplete data, interpretation accelerates. Action follows. Consequence trails behind. The unsettling realization is that the flaw lies not in individual character, but in structural cognition. We are built to seek patterns quickly. We are built to convert ambiguity into narrative. In daylight, this instinct often serves survival. In darkness, literal or informational, it can mislead. Leaders often believe they are responding rationally to available data. They do not perceive the assumptions forming between signals. They trust continuity. They trust the plan. But uncertainty does not vanish when ignored. It waits. When future officers studied that night and absorbed its streamlined lesson, they learned procedure more than psychology. They learned how to strengthen communication lines, how to design redundant signals. Yet, unless they confronted the deeper tendency to assume coherence in the absence of clarity, the vulnerability remained. The night, then, becomes less about geography and more about cognition. If darkness consistently produces misjudgment across eras and domains, perhaps the most important lesson is not strictly military. It may be philosophical. It may concern how humans confront ambiguity and how stories later reshape those confrontations into certainty. By now, the night we have followed begins to loosen its grip on geography. It is no longer confined to one battlefield, one command tent, one flare, rising too soon into black sky. It stretches outward, becoming less specific and more symbolic. The night is any moment when incomplete information meets pressure to act. It is the hour before sunrise in a war room where reports contradict one another and waiting feels dangerous. It is the emergency meeting where leaders must choose direction before facts settle. It is the split second between perception and response, when assumption rushes forward to fill silence. The original battle becomes emblem rather than anomaly. Its tragedy mirrors countless decisions made under urgency, some military, some political, some personal. The structure repeats: darkness thick with uncertainty, movement triggered by fear of hesitation, a narrative later crafted in calm daylight to explain what urgency disrupted. Societies remember outcomes. They build monuments to them. They record territorial shifts, casualty totals, treaties signed. What they rarely preserve with equal clarity is the texture of confusion while events were still unfolding, the private doubt, the second guessing, the fragmented signals misread as meaning. History is written in daylight. Decisions are made in darkness. When historians compare archived communications across wars and eras, they notice a quiet pattern. Real-time messages are filled with uncertainty, questions, partial reports, conflicting accounts. Post-event summaries often present continuity, decisive resistance, coordinated advancement, structured retreat. The gap between lived confusion and retrospective clarity repeats. Perhaps this gap is inevitable. The human mind seeks order once danger passes. We arrange memory to make it bearable. We compress hours of disorientation into sentences that reassure. Perhaps every generation has its own night it barely understands. Some nights are literal, operations planned under stars, meetings held before dawn. Others are invisible, but just as dark moments when information is incomplete. But stakes are high, when leaders must choose between delay and action, without knowing which is safer. The tragedy of that original battlefield now feels less isolated and more universal. Its structure does not belong to one army or one century. It belongs to the tension between urgency and uncertainty embedded in human experience. If humanity continues making decisions in informational darkness and continues simplifying them afterward to maintain coherence, what cycle are we repeating? The question drifts beyond military strategy. It touches governance, crisis management, collective memory itself. We act under pressure. We reconstruct with clarity. We move forward without always examining the fragile space in between. Yet, there is something different about pausing here, about resisting the compression. To recognize the universal night is not to condemn action. It is to acknowledge vulnerability. It is to see that misjudgment under darkness is not aberration, but pattern. It is to understand that stories told later in daylight often conceal the uncertainty that shaped them. This documentary began with one sentence in a textbook, a compressed description of a night that cost thousands of lives. Now that night stands as metaphor, an echo across time, whispering about the cost of impatience and the comfort of simplifications. The lens will narrow once more, returning to that original field. But this time, we will not allow it to be flattened into summary. We will reconstruct it carefully, moment by moment, stripping away the myth and the smoothing, allowing the darkness to exist in full detail. We return now to the field, but not as it was described in speeches or textbooks. We return with the benefit of diaries, written by trembling hands, memos buried in administrative files, and dispatches stamped with precise timestamps. The night regains its hours, its minutes, its breath. 1940. Units assemble in near silence. Lanterns are dimmed and shielded. The revised order has circulated, advancing the maneuver under cover of darkness. Several soldiers note in their journals an unease about the sudden shift from dawn to night, but no objections survive beyond private thought. 2005. The first movement begins along the left flank. Formations hold steady, though terrain proves uneven. A messenger dispatched earlier to clarify signal timing has not yet returned. His absence is noted, but not deemed urgent. 2017. A flare rises prematurely from a secondary position. A later memo describes it as miscalculated altitude. In the moment, it appears abrupt and threatening. Those advancing near the center interpret the light as incoming artillery confirmation. 2019. The first shots are fired. There is no coordinated enemy response at this stage. Archived dispatches confirm that opposing forces were still repositioning defensively. Uncertain whether a full assault had begun. 2023. Crossfire intensifies. Along a converging stretch of terrain, survivors later describe hearing familiar call signs, shouted across overlapping lines. Commands to cease fire compete with instinctive reaction. 2031. A delayed messenger finally reaches an intermediary officer with a cautionary note regarding signal overlap. The message does not reach the commanding tent until much later. By this time, multiple units have shifted direction, believing resistance to be concentrated ahead, rather than within 2038. Medical dispatch logs record the first cluster of severe casualties. The majority are located along sectors where formations converged unexpectedly. 2044. Another flare attempts to correct positioning, but is interpreted differently by units already on edge. Gunfire answers light again. Panic multiplies. 2052. Opposing forces, having observed chaotic firing patterns inconsistent with organized advance, begin coordinated counterfire. What happened in those first 47 minutes changed everything. Cross-referenced casualty ledgers reveal a striking fact. The majority of fatalities occurred before sustained enemy resistance was fully organized. Within that compressed window, momentum shifted irreversibly. Confusion outpaced command. Sound outran confirmation. Official summaries later describe the engagement as prolonged and fiercely contested throughout the night. Yet the decisive collapse, the fracturing of formation, the internal crossfire, the loss of cohesion occurred early. By the time structured resistance emerged from the opposing side, the advancing units were already destabilized. In real time, it did not feel like collapse. It felt like escalation, each minute layered urgency upon urgency. Reports sent upward described engagement, not disorientation. Silence from certain sectors was interpreted as progress rather than fracture. 20:110. Commanders inside tents, still piecing together fragmented information, believe the maneuver remains within acceptable variation. No full withdrawal order is issued. 21:30. Sporadic attempts to regroup fail amid noise and reduced visibility. Units that attempt to reposition encounter confusion about who occupies adjacent ground. As the hours pass, the battle becomes something different than its first phase. Counterfire solidifies. Defensive lines harden. Casualties accumulate. But the foundation has already shifted. The night, seen minute by minute, feels less like an inevitable clash and more like a sequence of small misinterpretations layered rapidly together. A flare. A delayed message. A silence mistaken for success. For the first time, the timeline stands without softening language. No phrasing like heavy resistance to absorb ambiguity. No gentle abstraction. It is vivid, human, flawed. And having slowed the night to its actual pace, one question lingers beyond the reconstruction. What does it mean that these 47 minutes were later compressed into a sentence? There is a moment in every unfolding disaster when it is still only a risk. It rarely arrives with spectacle. It does not announce itself as pivotal. It looks, instead, like hesitation. A brief pause in which someone senses that something is not aligning. At 2028, according to reconstructed logs and cross-reference testimony, a junior officer stationed near the center of the advancing line sent a concise message backward. The wording was cautious but clear. Signals overlapping. Units drifting, request temporary halt for repositioning. The message traveled by runner. It reached an intermediary commander position between field units and the main command tent. By then, gunfire had intensified, though not yet from organized opposition. The commander read the warning under dim lantern light. He annotated the margin, possibly exaggerated due to low visibility. There was still time to stop. Nothing irreversible had occurred beyond initial casualties. Formations, though strained, could have been pulled back to re-establish spacing. The premature flare could have been contextualized. Communication channels could have been realigned before opposition fully engaged. But in the moment, context matters. The intermediary commander faced incomplete information. Reports upward already framed the engagement as forward contact. Silence from certain flanks appeared stable. To halt the advance prematurely risked appearing reactive, even hesitant. Archival notation reveals something subtle in the decision to continue. The dismissal of the junior officer's warning referenced not only battlefield conditions, but perception. Avoid signaling uncertainty to upper command during active push. The phrase is brief, almost offhand, yet within it lies the hinge. The decision to proceed was influenced not by confirmed tactical necessity, but by a reluctance to appear indecisive. Momentum, once initiated, felt difficult to interrupt without visible justification. To pause during what might be forward engagement risked signaling doubt. Tragedy did not require malice. It required impatience. The warning was not ignored outright. It was absorbed and interpreted through the lens of existing belief that the maneuver was progressing within acceptable variance. The human mind protects continuity. Once a plan begins, deviation feels heavier than continuation. At 2035, confirmation was sent downward. Maintain advance. Adjust locally as needed. No full halt authorized. Minutes later, the overlapping formations tightened further. Crossfire intensified. The window narrowed. From a distance of decades, it is tempting to isolate this moment as singular error. But within that tent, it felt ordinary. One decision among many. A balance between caution and resolve. Thousands of lives pivoted on perception rather than reality. The simplicity is unsettling. No dramatic miscalculation of terrain, no betrayal of intelligence. just a hesitation reframed as resilience, a warning softened into overcaution, a desire to maintain confidence overshadowing the invitation to pause. The night now feels less like fate and more like extension. One small dismissal, extending outward across minutes, across gunfire, across casualty lists. There is no accusation here, only weight. When examined closely, the moment reveals how fragile large outcomes can be, how easily human pride, even in modest forms, influences continuity, how decisions taken in good faith, shaped by incomplete information and concern for cohesion, can cascade. The night is no longer abstract. It is not just darkness and confusion. It is a margin note, a signature, a choice to proceed. And having slowed it to this precise pivot, the question deepens. What does it mean that such a moment was later compressed into ceremony? What does it say about memory that the fragile hinge vanished from the telling? Now that the night has been fully seen, the lens must widen one final time, not to judge those within it, but to understand what we do with such knowledge. Now that the minutes have been restored and the hinge revealed, there is a different kind of work to do, not reconstruction, but recognition. When we finally look directly at that night, without ceremonial framing, without strategic gloss, it feels quieter than expected. There is no villain standing clearly in the center, no dramatic betrayal or hidden directive waiting to be exposed. There are only ordinary people operating within pressure, uncertainty, and human instinct. The battle does not dissolve into accusation. It settles into complexity. For decades, some assumed that if the internal confusion had been minimized, there must have been dramatic concealment. Yet when historians compared dispatches, memos, letters, and later summaries, they discovered something less theatrical. The inconsistencies were real, but they were gradual. Language softened over time. Emphasis shifted. Edges were rounded. There was no sweeping cover-up, only discomfort avoided. The tragedy is ordinary. That is what makes it powerful. It reveals how institutions and individuals alike prefer coherence to ambiguity. It shows how, once events conclude, the impulse to stabilize memory often outweighs the impulse to preserve friction. The night was not transformed through deception. It was shortened through preference. And shortening changes understanding. If you tell the story in one paragraph, the flair is incidental. The delayed messenger is forgettable. The dismissed warning is invisible. The majority of casualties appear to belong naturally to sustained engagement rather than to the first fractured moments. If you sit with the timeline, if you allow those first 47 minutes to unfold slowly, the texture shifts entirely. You feel the fragility of formation, the speed at which assumption overtook confirmation, the weight of a marginal note that could have paused momentum. The difference between truth and myth is often just how long we're willing to look. Truth, in this case, does not contradict bravery. It does not erase sacrifice. It simply refuses to compress it into something more comfortable than it was. It keeps the uneven pacing. It acknowledges the human vulnerability behind the outcome. When we allow ourselves to examine the night without seeking to defend or condemn, something else emerges. Humility. Humility about decision-making under uncertainty. Humility about how easily perception replaces reality. Humility about how memory can be shaped by what feels safer to repeat. There is a quiet dignity in that humility. The soldiers remain brave. The leaders remain human. The institution remains complex. None are reduced to caricature. Instead, they stand inside a fuller frame, one that includes hesitation and misinterpretation alongside resolve. This contemplative pause does not exist to reopen wounds. It exists to resist simplification, to acknowledge that events shaped by darkness deserve daylight long enough to preserve their texture. History does not lie about the night. It shortens it. And when we accept the shortened version without question, we inherit not only its clarity, but its omissions. The field where that battle occurred does not require our analysis. The grass grows without commentary, but our understanding does. It grows only when we are willing to linger. If one night, examined carefully, reveals so much about memory, framing, and human instinct, then perhaps it offers something beyond itself. Perhaps it invites reflection, not only on that battlefield, but on every compressed hour scattered throughout history. And so the story prepares to widen once more, not toward accusation, but toward responsibility, toward the choices societies make when remembering, toward the quiet question of how we decide which details endure and which dissolve. The next step is not further reconstruction. It is meditation on what we carry forward. When the noise fades and the dead are buried, every nation faces the same quiet question: how do we remember this? Clear stories offer relief. They draw clean lines where events once tangled. They provide identifiable heroes and defined enemies. They arrange chaos into arcs that begin, rise, and conclude with meaning. For societies emerging from trauma, that clarity feels necessary. It steadies identity. It allows children to learn without inheriting confusion as burden. Chaos unsettles identity. To admit that tragedy emerged not only from opposition but from uncertainty within can feel destabilizing. Nations built on confidence prefer narratives that reinforce purpose. Clear outcomes reassure citizens that sacrifice fit into a larger structure. They allow healing to move forward without lingering too long on fragile details. But comfort comes at a cost. When history removes confusion from its core, it risks teaching confidence without humility. Future generations inherit examples of strength and determination, but not always the vulnerability that shaped those moments. They learn how to advance. They may not learn how to hesitate. The battlefield then becomes metaphor. It stands for any arena where humans confront urgency, political chambers, emergency response centers, corporate boardrooms, family decisions made under strain. In each case, the temptation is the same: compress complexity into something manageable. Highlight success, downplay miscalculation, move forward without reopening uncertainty. Clear stories are easier to carry, but are they easier to repeat? The question lingers because repetition is rarely intentional. It flows from inherited framing. If we remember only bravery, we may overlook fragility. If we highlight resilience without examining misjudgment, we risk confusing decisiveness with wisdom. Societies do not simplify tragedy out of cruelty. They simplify to survive. Coherence allows unity. Unity allows recovery. The instinct is understandable, even compassionate. Yet the messy parts, the overlapping signals, the delayed messenger, the dismissed warning, are not distractions from the lesson. They are the lesson. They reveal how easily intention can outrun information. They expose how pressure reshapes perception. When those details vanish into summary, something subtle disappears with them, a reminder of limits, a caution against overconfidence, a recognition that leadership requires not only strength but doubt. This reflection does not demand that we abandon honor. Sacrifice remains meaningful, courage remains real, but honoring fully may require lingering longer than comfort prefers. The audience is no longer a distant observer of that battlefield. Each listener participates in collective remembering. Every generation receives stories shaped by those before it, and each generation decides, consciously or not, how much complexity to preserve. If simplification feels natural, perhaps responsibility feels less so. It requires patience. It requires willingness to sit with ambiguity rather than rushing toward coherence. Clear stories bind communities. They provide shared language. Yet beneath their elegance lies a choice about what to emphasize and what to soften. As we consider that night once more, not as legend, but as layered reality, the broader question takes shape. If simplification is human nature, what responsibility does each generation hold when revisiting the past? History is often spoken of as if it was settled, as though events rest permanently in the form first printed. But history is not stone. It is revisited again and again by scholars leaning over archives, by filmmakers shaping scripts, by teachers choosing which passages to emphasize, by listeners deciding which details to remember. Each retelling carries weight. To revisit a difficult chapter does not unravel pride. It does not diminish sacrifice. Instead, it deepens understanding. There is a difference between honoring and polishing. To polish is to smooth away friction. To honor is to look fully, even when the image is imperfect. To honor the past is not to polish it, but to understand it. Recent academic movements have begun to speak more openly about restoring ambiguity into historical narratives. Scholars argue that complexity does not weaken collective identity, it strengthens it. When students encounter not only triumph but uncertainty, not only strategy but misjudgment, they learn something more durable than pride. They learn humility. Humility builds resilience. In classrooms and publications that embrace layered storytelling, the focus shifts from finding heroes without flaw to understanding systems, without illusion. The goal is not to undermine confidence, but to ground it. A society aware of its vulnerabilities is often more prepared than one convinced of its infallibility. The night we followed earlier now feels different in this light. It is no longer simply a tragedy compressed into a footnote or a myth elevated into ceremony. It becomes a case study in how stories shape decision-making. It shows how the framing of an event can influence not only memory, but future action. If leaders study only polished narratives, they may inherit confidence without caution. If citizens consume only simplified summaries, they may miss the subtle warnings embedded in ambiguity. Remembering fully is an act of maturity. It requires patience. It requires resisting the comfort of conclusions that feel complete. It asks listeners to stay present with moments that do not resolve cleanly. It acknowledges that human decision-making is rarely pure, often pressured, and frequently partial. This reflection does not accuse earlier generations of wrongdoing. They acted within their circumstances, balancing unity and accountability as they understood them. But each generation inherits not only the events of the past, but the interpretations of those events. With inheritance comes choice. We can accept compressed stories as fixed, or we can widen them carefully. We can recognize courage, while also examining the hesitation and miscalculation that accompanied it. We can hold respect for sacrifice and respect for truth simultaneously. The responsibility in retelling is not about rewriting everything. It is about refusing to shorten what deserves length. As viewers, as readers, as participants in shared memory, we shape which details endure. We decide whether a night remains a sentence or expands into reflection. The final step is simple yet profound, to return once more to that field under darkness, not as audience seeking drama, but as witnesses willing to remain a little longer. We return to the hill, not as it appeared in reports or on maps, not beneath arrows and annotations, but as it is now, grass bending under a quiet wind, earth settled, darkness resting gently over uneven ground. There is no movement except the slow drift of air, no gunfire, no shouted orders, no flare breaking the sky, only stillness. The night no longer feels ominous. It feels patient. In the beginning, that darkness held mystery. It concealed error and amplified fear. It allowed silence to be mistaken for progress. It turned small misinterpretations into irreversible consequence. We entered this story when history had already rushed past it, compressing thousands of lives into efficient phrasing. Now, standing here again, the compression has been undone. The wind moves across the hill as it did then, indifferent to human urgency. The grass bends and rises again. The landscape carries no visible scar from the decisions made upon it. Yet we know, now, that what unfolded here was not a single dramatic clash of destinies. It was a convergence of impatience, assumption, and partial sight. What cost thousands of lives was not only one mistaken night. It was the human tendency to move forward without fully seeing. Darkness did not create malice. It created ambiguity. Pressure did not create cruelty. It created momentum, and momentum, when paired with incomplete knowledge, becomes something fragile. The hill remains unchanged by our understanding. But we are not. Some nights change the world. Others change how we remember it. This one did both. It altered procedures quietly in the years that followed. It shaped reforms that made future operations safer. It lived in margins of doctrine and in the silence between veterans' words. It slipped through textbooks as a brief sentence, then expanded again when someone paused long enough to look. And beyond this hill, beyond this war, beyond this century, the pattern continues. Every generation faces its own darkness. Moments when decisions must be made before clarity arrives. Moments when silence feels like stability and movement feels safer than pause. Moments when confidence can overshadow caution. The lesson is not to condemn action. Life does not allow indefinite waiting. The lesson is to recognize the texture of uncertainty while it is still unfolding. If we remember only outcomes, we risk repeating misjudgment. If we remember the fragile hinge, the flare misread, the warning dismissed, the silence misinterpreted, we carry something else forward. Awareness. The camera, if it could, would pull back slowly now. The hill shrinking into wider terrain. The terrain dissolving into map. The map fading into night sky. There is no accusation in this ending. No finger pointed across time. Only a quiet invitation to resist shortening what deserves to be seen in full length. Chapter 1 began with compression. A sentence in a book that barely paused long enough to breathe. Chapter 10 ends with expansion. The night has regained its hours, its hesitation, its human vulnerability. It is no longer a footnote buried between campaigns. It has depth. It has detail. It remains night. But it is no longer opaque, and in that clarity, perhaps, lies the only form of justice history can offer. Not changing what happened, but changing how long we are willing to look at it.